Alright guys, in the last video we kind of went through the whole workflow of how Redux works. We commit an action such as the register user, and in the actions file here we went ahead and created an action type of test dispatch. We dispatched that to the reducer along with a payload, which is the user data that was added, and inside the reducer we then manipulated the state to include that new user. Okay, and then in our component we went ahead and mapped state to props and set auth as a prop inside of our component, and we then just outputted. We went up here and we grabbed the user from the auth prop, and we just said if the user exists then output the name, if it doesn't then it's null. Okay, and it obviously existed once we submitted the form. All right, now that was all basically just for instructional purposes. A lot of this stuff we're not keeping, but I wanted you to kind of understand how that works. And I'm sure a lot of you already do, but for those of you that don't, now we're going to continue on with the actual register user action. So initially we did the Axios request within the register component. We're not going to do that, so we can actually take away the import of Axios, and let's actually bring that into the auth actions. So we'll go ahead and put that up at the top here, and let's grab the let's see, so the actual request, I'm gonna uncomment that, cut it out, and go to auth actions. And in the register user here we need to do something additional, because now we're dealing with asynchronous data. We're fetching from our back end, we have to wait for the response, and then we're going to dispatch. So this is where the Thunk middleware comes in, and in order to achieve what we want to do, we have to also add in dispatch to our function here. So we basically want to put another arrow and add in dispatch, okay, which is just an easier way than having to put our register user function and then the dispatch function inside of it. This is a cleaner way to do it. All right, and now what we'll do is paste in our Axios request. Okay, so this now is going to be user data. I keep doing user date. All right, so we're going to hit our backend API, pass in the user data, which comes in through here. And if it's successful, obviously we don't want to just console log. What I want to do is redirect. Now, to redirect from an action is it's not complicated, but there's a couple extra steps that you need to do. Okay, and we'll get to that. But before we do that, I want to handle the errors. Now, we were doing this right in the component, so we just simply set the component error state. Well, we can't use this .set state from within an action because this is meant to be used within that component. So this is where we're actually going to dispatch an action type called getErrors. Now, since this is within an asynchronous call, this is where Thunk comes in, and instead of just returning, we actually need to call dispatch. Okay, so we need to say dispatch and then pass in the object with the type, which in this case is going to be getErrors, which doesn't exist yet, and then the payload that we want to send is going to be the error response. Remember, we get that with error.response.data. Okay, let's see, it looks like I have some kind of issue here. We don't want that. And what else did I do here? Oh, this should only be one. There we go. All right, so again, since we're making an AJAX call here and we're waiting for our response, we're not going to just return the type and the payload. We need to actually call dispatch, which we can access from right here. Okay, and that's what Redux Thunk allows us to do. So now what we need to do is bring in getErrors. We need to create that in our type and bring it in. Now, test dispatch we're not going to use anymore. That was just for, like I said, instructional purposes. We're going to bring in getErrors. Let's save this. Let's go to types.js, and we don't need this anymore, so we'll just replace it with get_errors. Let's change this to getErrors. and save. Now this isn't going to be, we don't want this in our auth reducer. Let's go to our auth reducer and let's get rid of the test dispatch. So we'll get rid of the case here as well and save that. Now let's create an error reducer. Okay, so in reducers, let's say new file, error reducer.js. And what we can do is just copy the entire auth reducer. And we'll paste that in. Now, as far as our initial state, we're not going to have anything specific. It's just going to be an empty object because I want the object to be the errors object itself. Okay. Now let's import here get errors from our types. Okay, so that's going to be from /actions/types. And then we need to add this as a case. So let's add case get errors. And then what we want to do is simply return the action.payload. And that's it. Okay, because the payload is going to include, if we look at this, it's going to include the errors object, which comes from our server. This is the exact same thing we were returning in the component when we made our Axios request there. What we're doing now is just putting it into our Redux state. All right, now in our register component, we want to bring in errors so that we can use them in our state. Okay, so where we brought in the auth state and mapped it to a property, let's also bring in errors and say state.errors. Okay, and one thing I forgot to do, which this just reminded me, is we didn't add it to our root reducer. So in reducers index.js, let's bring in our error reducer. And let's say errors, error reducer, whoops. Just like that. Yeah, that should be right. So let's save that. Close that up. And now when get errors is dispatched, it's going to, if there are any errors, it's going to add it to this. Okay. Now, as it is now, this is accessed with this.props.errors. Or yeah, this.props.errors. And what we could do is if we go up here, we're getting our errors from our component state, right? We could do errors equals this.props, but I don't want to do that. Whoops. What I actually want to do is keep it as the state. I want to create a new lifecycle method called component will receive props. And this runs when your component receives new properties. So let's add that here, component will receive props. And it takes in a parameter called next props. Okay, and what we can do here is we can test to see, we can test for certain properties. And what we want to test for is the errors property, okay? Because remember, we mapped the error state to the errors prop. So let's say if next props dot errors, okay? And we're going to check for that. If there is an errors prop, then we're going to say this dot set state, and we want to set the errors to next prop or next props dot errors. That way we get the errors from our Redux state. It gets put into props with map state to props, and then once we receive new properties, and if errors is included, then we're going to set it to the component state. Okay, that way we don't have to change anything that we already did down here. Okay, because it's coming from, the errors are still going to be coming from the component state. All right, hopefully that makes sense. Now we can get rid of this, and we can get rid of this. This was just for testing. And again, the errors will be in the state because of what we just did, and all this stuff will still work. The class name, it'll display the error and all that. Now, one other thing we want to do is just add errors to our prop types. Okay, so we'll say prop types. It's going to be an object and is required. All right, we'll save that. Now, let's see if the errors actually still work when if our form doesn't work. So I'm going to submit, and there we go. And if we take a look at our Redux extension and we look at the diff, look at the errors. So now the errors are actually in Redux instead of just stored in our component. Okay, and if we look at the complete state, you can see now we have auth and errors. Auth is just the initial stuff here, and errors includes all of our errors. If I put a name in here and submit, you can see that that name error has gone away. You can also see that the type getErrors, the action type, is being called every time I submit this. If I submit it again, there it goes, and we get our state filled, our error state. Now, like I said, you could have did it differently. You could have put an errors object in auth itself instead of creating a whole new reducer, but I don't want to have to do that for every piece of state where we need errors. I just want to have a main errors reducer. Okay, it's just what I chose to do. So if we go back to our actions, our auth action, this is all set. Okay, if there's an error, that's all set. It'll display the error. Now, what about when it actually when the user registers? We don't want to just console log the data. We want to actually redirect to the login page. Now, with React Router, it's easy to redirect from within a component. If we were inside a component, we could simply say this.props.history.push, and we could go to like /dashboard. We could do something like that, but we can't do that by default from within an action. What we have to do is we have to go to our component. So let's go to register.js, and we're going to bring in something called with router from React Router DOM. All right, so let's go right below the prop types and say import with router, and that's going to be from React Router DOM. Okay, now what we need to do with this is go down to where we export, so the very last line, and see where we have our register component. We just need to wrap this in with router. So we want to just add that. All right, we want to wrap it like that, and then the last thing we need to do is the last thing we need to do in this component is go to where we called the register user and add a second parameter here of this.props.history. So what this is allowing us to do is it's going to allow us to use this.props.history to redirect from within this action. Okay, because we could do this easily within the component, but in order to do it within the action, we need to take these steps and use with router. So let's save this. Let's go back to our auth actions, and here, instead of console logging, actually we need to catch that history, that this.props history that we passed in should be a second parameter here, and we'll just call it history. And then we should simply be able to say history.push, and then to where we want to go, which is going to be the login form. Okay, once they register and it's successful, I just want them to go to login, and that should do it. All right, so let's save this. Okay, so what it should do is if there's any errors, you already saw what happens. It'll show in the form. That's all fine. If it passes, then it should register because we're hitting that backend API, and then it should just redirect us to login. Okay, and we won't be able to log in yet. That's a whole new can of worms that we're going to get to next, but I just want to be able to actually register using React and Redux. So let's go back and let's make sure we have no errors here. All right, good. And let's go ahead and try to register a user. Now I'm going to go to MLab and just get rid of any users we have, if there are any. Yep, so I'm going to get rid of this user. And let's go back and register, let's say John Doe, John at Gmail. And let's try to not match the passwords. Okay, so we're good. Errors are working. You can see the error state gets filled. Let's make a match and submit. Okay, we get redirected to our login. And let's check MLab. Let's reload. And there we go. So now we can register a user. And it's all happening through our Redux action. All right, so now that the register is done, we're going to get to the login, okay? And this is probably one of the most difficult parts of this course, because remember how it works. If you think back to our API, we have to hit the login route, which gives us a token, and then we need to have that token stored, and we need to send that token along with any request to access any private routes. So our dashboard, things like that. So what we need to do is store that token in local storage and have it available to send with any requests if we're logged in. Okay, so that's what we're going to jump into next.